Imagine an entire island turning red, not with sunsets or autumn leaves, but with millions.
We spent $1 billion building machines to save this paradise, only to watch them fail. But then, we released an army of 10,000 lab-grown soldiers with 10 legs and a relentless hunger. What happened next didn't just defy logic, it rewrote the rules of life itself. For decades, we tried to fix our waters the human way, with sheer financial force, industrial muscle, and a touch of scientific arrogance. We treated the ocean like a broken combustion engine, convinced that if we just threw enough capital at the right parts, we could switch life back on. In Florida's Indian River Lagoon and the Chesapeake Bay, the strategy was the same: engineer our way out of the mess. We deployed massive, multi-million-dollar dredging ships, monsters of steel that roared 24 hours a day. These machines attempted to suck the muck from the bottom, a black, mayonnaise-like toxic sludge that is the byproduct of decades of industrial neglect and suburban runoff. We spent over $500 million on these dredgers alone. They were impressive to look at, and they made great headlines for politicians. But in reality, it was like trying to vacuum a desert during a sandstorm. The sludge returned faster than the pumps could extract it, and the process itself stirred up even more toxins, suffocating whatever life was left. Then came the chemical filtration plants. We built high-tech facilities that looked like something out of a science fiction movie, costing tens of millions in annual maintenance. We installed giant, industrial-grade aeration systems, massive underwater fans designed to pump oxygen into the suffocating hypoxic depths. We essentially put the entire ecosystem on a mechanical ventilator. But here is the bitter truth that no one wanted to admit. You cannot repair a biological soul with a wrench, a pump, or a chemical scrub. These machines were loud, energy-hungry, and ultimately, they were losing a war against a microscopic enemy they couldn't even see. The most heartbreaking failure of all, and perhaps the most expensive, was the seagrass restoration project. Seagrass is the absolute foundation of the lagoon. It is the lungs of the water and the nursery for every fish we love to catch. Without it, the water turns into a stagnant, toxic soup. The government and private donors poured tens of millions of dollars into replanting efforts. This wasn't just dumping seeds. This was precision agriculture underwater. Thousands of hours were spent by professional divers, meticulously hand-planting individual seagrass shoots into the seabed, one by one, mile after mile. It was a Herculean effort of human will. We even used biodegradable staples to hold the grass down, hoping it would take root before the next storm. But the ocean had a different plan. Almost overnight, a fuzzy, suffocating layer known as turf algae, fed by the very pollution we were trying to fight, swept across the floor like a wildfire. It acted like a parasitic blanket, wrapping around those million-dollar plants and choking them in the dark. It didn't just outcompete the grass, it strangled it. In less than 24 hours, years of work and millions of dollars were erased. The divers came back the next morning to find nothing but a slimy, green tomb. We were fighting a forest fire with a squirt gun, and the bill for this failed miracle was staggering. We had reached a stalemate with nature, and nature was winning. While the tech giants and engineering firms were cashing checks for half-billion-dollar contracts, a small team of researchers at the Mote Marine Laboratory proposed something so cheap it was almost insulting to the engineers. They didn't want a bigger pump. They didn't want a new chemical patent. They wanted a biological reset button. They proposed using the Caribbean king crab. Now, let's look at the economics here, because they are staggering. While a dredging ship costs $50,000 a day to operate, a single crab costs just a few dollars to raise in a hatchery. But these aren't just scavengers. They are the ultimate underwater lawnmowers. These 10-legged knights don't need electricity, they don't need spare parts, and they have one singular, relentless mission: to eat the very algae that killed our million-dollar grass. In 2026, the team prepared to release 10,000 of these lab-grown soldiers into waters so toxic, most experts believed it was a death sentence. The scientific community was split. Some called it a brilliant return to nature-based solutions. Others called it a sacrificial release, convinced the crabs would be dead within 48 hours. Could a few thousand crabs succeed where $1 billion in technology failed? Could the low-cost scavenger be the key to unlocking a dead river? The answer would shock the world and change the face of conservation forever. Stick with us as we dive into the secret war beneath the waves. If you're ready to see how nature finally fights back, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You don't want to miss the moment the tide finally turned. To understand why this worked, we have to look past the hard shell and the pincers. We have to look at the sheer biological brilliance of the Magoimithrax spinosissimus. In the complex hierarchy of marine biology, not all herbivores are created equal. Most fish and sea urchins are picky eaters. They avoid the thick, carpet-like turf algae because it is difficult to digest, physically abrasive, and often carries chemical toxins meant to repel anything with a stomach. But the Caribbean king crab, it is an evolutionary tank designed for one thing: total consumption. These crabs possess specialized mouthparts, maxillipeds, that act like precision industrial shears. While other animals nibble at the tips of algae, these crabs scrape. They possess calcified pincers with a grip strength that allows them to graze the algae down to the bare white rock. This is the reset button the lagoon desperately needed. By clearing the surface completely, the crabs aren't just eating, they are reopening real estate. In a dead zone, the most valuable currency is space. By removing the green shroud of algae, the crabs were essentially cleaning the canvas so that other, more delicate species could finally find a place to hold on. Here is the most shocking chemical discovery that came out of the Florida study: the very pollution that was killing the river. The massive spikes of nitrogen and phosphorus from farm runoff was actually being recycled by the crabs. Through a fascinating process of bioaccumulation, these crabs consume the nitrogen-rich algae and use those specific proteins to build their own massive chitinous shells. They were literally taking Florida's toxic wastewater and turning it into biological armor. Think about the irony. The very poison that caused the ecological collapse became the bricks and mortar for the soldiers sent to fix it. Scientists were fascinated by the metabolic efficiency of these creatures. Could these crabs act as a living filter, permanently locking away the excess nutrients that were choking the lagoon? They weren't just cleaning the water, they were physically removing the pollution and wearing it as a suit of armor. Creating an army of 10,000 crabs is a logistical nightmare that starts in a laboratory. This was not a matter of catching wild crabs and moving them. That would be a zero-sum game for the environment. The team at Mote Marine Laboratory had to master the art of mass rearing. The first hurdle was the larval stage. In the wild, a single female can release up to 50,000 larvae at a time, but 99.9% are eaten by predators within minutes. In the lab, the survival rate should be higher, but a dark instinct gets in the way: sibling cannibalism. From the moment they hatch, these larvae are aggressive, hungry hunters. If they aren't fed a precise, microscopic diet of rotifers and brine shrimp at the exact right intervals, they turn on each other. The scientists had to design Creasel Tank's high-density rearing systems using circular flow technology. This keeps the water moving in a constant, gentle vortex, keeping the larvae suspended in a liquid cloud. This makes it physically harder for them to grab and eat their brothers and sisters. It was a 2-4-hour-a-day operation. One mistake in the water temperature or a 5-minute failure in the oxygen pump could wipe out an entire battalion of 5,000 soldiers in a single afternoon. As the crabs grew from microscopic specks into juveniles about the size of a silver dollar, a new challenge emerged. These were silver spoon crabs. They had lived their entire lives in sterile, crystal-clear, filtered water with a perfect pH balance. If they were suddenly dropped into the muck of a toxic, low-oxygen river, the shock would be fatal. The researchers began a process called environmental hardening. This was the basic training for our 10-legged recruits. They slowly introduced stressed water from the lagoon into the hatchery tanks. They monitored the crabs' heart rates and metabolic stress levels like drill sergeants. They had to ensure these recruits could handle hypoxia, low oxygen, and that their immune systems were primed for the bacteria found in the wild. Finally, every single one of the 10,000 crabs was fitted with a tiny, fluorescent, visible implant elastomer, VIE tag. This was the serial number for our soldiers. Why go through this painstaking process? Because when the river recovered, the scientists needed to prove it wasn't a fluke. They needed to show that the crab cleaning the rock today was the same crab they raised in a tank 6 months ago. This was a forensic investigation into the power of life. The morning air was thick with Florida humidity and the heavy metallic scent of sulfur rising from the rotting algae in the lagoon. A fleet of small, flat-bottomed research boats sat at the dock, loaded with hundreds of white plastic crates. Inside, 10,000 Caribbean king crabs were clicking and clacking, a sound like thousands of tiny porcelain pebbles hitting glass. This was the D-Day of marine restoration. The transport was the most dangerous part of the entire operation. Crabs are highly sensitive to transport stress. If the water temperature fluctuates by even a few degrees, or if the oxygen levels in the transport tanks dip during the drive to the dock, the crabs release stress hormones that can trigger a fatal chain reaction. The team at Mote Marine Laboratory used specialized oxygenated transport bladders and monitored the temperature of every single crate with laser precision. The cost of this transport was a mere fraction of what a heavy dredging ship burns in diesel fuel in a single hour, yet the biological stakes felt infinitely higher. Every crate represented months of laboratory work and the potential for a new ecological era. As the boats reached the impact zone, a stretch of water where the seagrass had been completely erased, replaced by a sickly, opaque green shroud, the mood on the boats turned somber. You couldn't see more than 6 inches below the surface. This wasn't just water, it was a liquid tomb. One by one, the crates were lowered over the side. The 10,000 crabs were gently released into the gloom. They sank like tiny, armored stones. For the first few minutes, there was nothing but bubbles and the rippling wake of the boats. On the shore, critics and skeptics were already writing headlines about a failed experiment and sacrificial animals. The silence of the lagoon was deafening, but 3 days later, when the dive teams went down to check the point of release, they witnessed the first major shock of the project. The crabs hadn't fled to cleaner water, as many had predicted. In fact, they had done the opposite. They had anchored themselves to the dying stalks of the old grass and the algae-covered rocks, and they were eating. They were eating with a ferocity that the scientists had never seen, even in the controlled environment of the lab. It was as if their environmental hardening had worked too well. These lab-born recruits were attacking the turf algae like a starving army at a victory banquet. In a perfect circle around the initial release point, the gray, dead rock was starting to show its original white color. The ironclad knights had secured their first beachhead in the war against the muck. To appreciate the miracle that followed, we have to look at the physics of the riverbed. For decades, the Indian River Lagoon was trapped in what ecologists call a turbidity lock. This is a state where the water column is so thick with suspended solids and microscopic algae that sunlight, the literal engine of the ocean, cannot penetrate the depths. Below a certain point, it is eternal night. Seagrasses like Thalassia testudinum, turtle grass, are high-energy organisms. They aren't just plants, they are sophisticated solar panels. They require a light compensation point of nearly 25% of surface sunlight to survive. When the turf algae carpeted the floor, that light dropped to absolute zero. The seagrass didn't just die, it vanished from the record. But nature has a hidden backup plan buried in the mud. The seed bank. Deep within the toxic, anaerobic muck, a black sludge devoid of oxygen that smells like rotten eggs, millions of seagrass seeds lay dormant. Scientists have given these a haunting name: ghost seeds. These seeds are encased in a protective, carbon-rich husk that can withstand years of pollution and total darkness. They were waiting for a single chemical signal: the return of photons. But as long as the turf algae carpet existed, those seeds were buried in a biological tomb. This is where the 10,000 crabs changed the course of history. As they grazed, they weren't just eating, they were exfoliating the riverbed. Their sharp, calcified dactyls, the tips of their legs, scraped away the slimy biofilm and the thick algal mats, exposing the raw, sandy substrate underneath for the first time in a generation. Within 60 days of the release, the divers reported something that defied every mathematical model humans had created. They saw tiny, bright green spears poking through the black muck. It wasn't the grass the humans had tried to plant, it was the ghost seeds waking up. This was a biological phase shift. By simply removing the algae, the crabs had lowered the energy barrier for the entire system. Sunlight hit the sand, the temperature of the sediment rose by nearly 2 degrees Celsius, and the chemical signal was sent. The resurrection had begun. This process, which engineers estimated would take 50 years of mechanical dredging and $200 million in taxpayer funds, was happening for free, powered by the natural hunger of 10,000 soldiers. The shock to the scientific world wasn't just that the crabs lived, it was that they had unlocked a door to the past that humans thought was rusted shut forever. The recovery didn't stop with the grass. In ecology, there is a concept called a trophic cascade, and what we witnessed in the Indian River Lagoon was the holy grail of restoration. Once the seagrass, fueled by the crab's cleaning, reached a critical mass of about 20% coverage, it began to function as its own machine. It became a benthic filter. The long, flowing blades of the thalassia grass slowed down the water currents near the bottom. This physical slowing caused suspended silt and particles to drop out of the water column and settle into the roots of the grass. The water became clearer, which allowed more light to reach more seeds. But then, a second group of heroes emerged from the shadows, the bivalves. With the toxic turf algae receding and the water clarity improving, wild oysters and hard clam species that had been literally choked to death by silt for a decade began to settle on the very rocks the crabs had cleaned. The math of the clam. A single adult hard clam can filter up to 24 gallons of water a day. The multiplier effect. As the crabs cleaned the rocks, the clams moved in. As the clams filtered the water, more light reached the grass. As the grass grew, it trapped more silt for the clams. This is what scientists call a positive feedback loop. We weren't just adding animals to a tank, we were restarting a biological engine that had been stalled for 30 years. The 10,000 crabs were the spark plug, providing the initial burst of energy, but the clams and the seagrass were the pistons and the fuel that would keep the engine running long after the initial release. As the grass meadows expanded, they created something the lagoon hadn't seen in years. Structural complexity. To a human, it looks like a field of weeds. To a juvenile shrimp, a blue crab, or a baby snapper, it is a fortress. The shock to the research team came during their nightly surveys. They began to see an explosion of life in the crab zones. Millions of tiny crustaceans and juvenile fish were using the grass as a nursery. This is the hidden part of the resurrection. By providing a home for the smallest creatures, the crabs were essentially setting the table for the entire ocean. The nutrient cycle was no longer a dead end of rotting algae. It was being funneled back into living tissue. The pollution was being transformed into a thriving, vibrating web of life. In a collapsed ecosystem, the predators are always the first to leave and the last to return. They are the high-level consumers, and they require a massive amount of energy to sustain themselves. But by late 2026, the acoustic sensors submerged in the Lafayette River and the Indian River Lagoon began to pick up pings that hadn't been recorded in a generation. First came the juvenile bull sharks. These 3-foot predators followed the massive schools of mullet and menhaden that were now seeking shelter in the lush seagrass meadows. Then came the spotted sea trout, their silver, speckled bodies flashing in water that was finally clear enough for them to hunt by sight rather than just by vibration. The scientists realized that the crab experiment had moved beyond a simple cleanup project. It had become a target destination for the ocean's elite. The predators weren't just passing through, they were staying. They were establishing territories. The toxic river had been officially reclassified by the inhabitants themselves. It was now a hunting ground. But the most emotional moment for the entire team, the moment that brought veteran biologists to tears, was captured by a 4K drone flying over a crab-cleansed zone. In the center of the frame, 2 massive gray shadows drifted slowly over the bright green grass. It was a mother manatee and her calf. These 1,200-pound sea cows are the barometers of Florida's environmental soul. For 5 years, they had been the face of the crisis, found dead by the hundreds with stomachs full of sand and plastic because there was no grass left to eat. But here they were. They weren't just swimming, they were grazing. They were hovering over the ghost seeds that the 10,000 crabs had helped resurrect. The circle was officially complete. The smallest scavenger had provided a feast for the largest herbivore. The shock to the world was now undeniable. Nature doesn't need a billion-dollar machine. It needs a chance. The success of the 10,000 crabs in Florida did more than just clear a few miles of a toxic river. It sent a shockwave through the international scientific community. For the last 50 years, the global approach to environmental repair has been gray infrastructure. We built concrete seawalls, steel filtration plants, and plastic artificial reefs. We spent billions on hardware, but we forgot about the software, the living organisms that evolved over millions of years to do exactly what we were trying to simulate with machines. The crab. Blueprint is now being translated into every major language, from the Great Barrier Reef in Australia to the coral triangles of the Philippines and Indonesia. Researchers are abandoning the engineer's arrogance. They are realizing that biological infrastructure, the strategic reintroduction of a keystone species, is not just more effective, it is 100 times cheaper. In Australia, scientists are now looking at indigenous sea urchins and parrotfish as the janitors of the reef. Moving away from manual algae scrubbing, in California, the reintroduction of sea otters has been proven to save entire kelp forests from being turned into urchin barrens. In the Philippines, local communities are building crab hatcheries not for food, but as eco-defense systems to protect the coral that supports their entire economy. As successful as our 10,000 ironclad knights were, the team at Mote Marine Laboratory issued a stern, final warning that dampened the celebration. The crabs are a cleanup crew, but they are not a get-out-of-jail-free card. If we continue to pour millions of gallons of raw sewage, industrial fertilizer, and plastic runoff into these lagoons, even an army of 1 million crabs will eventually be overwhelmed. They are biological organisms, not magical filters. The shock to the world should not just be that nature can heal. It should be a wake-up call that we are the only species capable of stopping the wound from reopening. We have found the janitors of the ocean, but we are still the ones throwing the trash. The success of the 10,000 crabs is a second chance, a grace period, and it is one we cannot afford to waste. We began this journey by looking at a billion-dollar failure, a monument to human hubris and mechanical futility. We saw the roaring dredgers and the expensive chemical scrubs that promised a miracle but delivered a green tomb. We ends it by looking at a 10-legged scavenger, smaller than a dinner plate, covered in armor and fueled by nothing but the instinct to eat. The story of the 10,000 crabs is a fundamental shift in how we must view our place on this planet. We are not the masters of the earth. We are its most clumsy and destructive inhabitants. Our role in the 21st century is not to fix nature like we fix a broken car. Our role is to step back, stop the poisoning, and provide the support, the biological infantry that nature needs to fix itself. A $5 crab did more for Florida than a $5 million machine. That is the most humbling lesson of our time. Look at the Indian River Lagoon today. It is not perfect. The water still carries the scars of our past, but look closer. Beneath the surface, the ironclad knights are still down there. You can hear them if you lun deep enough, that clicking and clacking of progress. They are patrolling the grass, guarding the ghost seeds, and ensuring that the mother manatee and her calf have a home for another generation. Nature doesn't need our billions. It needs our humility. If this story changed the way you look at the natural world, help us spread the word. Every like, every share, and every subscription allows us to keep telling these stories that the billion-dollar industries would rather you didn't hear. Let us know in the comments, do you believe the future of our planet lies in more machines or in the hands and pincers of nature's own soldiers?